Hello, and welcome to this video where we will be continuing now our discussion starting from what we have already discussed in terms of data control frameworks, and then we saw data security controls which align with the framework. But then the question is where to apply that framework and which control is applicable to what kind of data. Now, the question of what kind of data, it's it's a very dominant one, and basically a data is defined among other things in terms of the state which it is in. And the state of a data is a much broader classification than what we have seen before in terms of the attribute, whether it's in the file, whether it's in the shared drive, and other classification like that. Dominantly, data has three states, and we would want to protect all those three states in order to make sure that the data protection is an end-to-end endeavor and it is not something applied piecemeal. Now, what are these three states? A data is classified in terms of a state as data at rest, data in motion, and the data in use. So what is data at rest? Uh, it's dominantly described by the static nature of the data. For example, data is lying in your hard drives, in the disk, in the external storage. It could also be in the cloud, and uh, it is it can be stored both at the hardware, but can also be stored, for example, in terms of the file configuration at the software level. Therefore, you can imagine that the data protection for the data at rest is applicable for both hardware or software. Now, the data at rest, the static nature of it, uh, doesn't mean that the data is not carrying any value or that it is not doing anything. It is just in terms of the state, data is lying at a place which is either not getting changed or its changes are recorded in the logging, or it's been picked up by the monitoring system or the capabilities that you may have. Now, then comes the second state, which is about data in motion, because data in rest is good, but you would want to, for example, exchange files. You would want to exchange information, and the data that carries that information also need to move places. That is what is data in motion, which can be transferred over a network in a digital sense, but you can also imagine carrying a handwritten letter from one city to another. That could also be an example of data in motion. Now, in the technical terms, because the asset management, where we are dominantly looking in the digital world and not the physical world, we encrypt the network traffic in order to make sure that the end-to-end processing of the message or the passing of the information is protected. And we make sure that this is done both at the internal network and at the external network if the data crisscrosses that boundaries. Then the last state, which is about the actual uses of data, where we are actually using it in terms of actually reading a file, in terms of actually using the data stored in the cloud. For example, it could be customer information, it could be an API, billing information, and things like that. This is where you may want to understand that encryption at this stage is not a very handy thing, because if while using the data it's encrypted, then either it will be in the garbled form that you will not understand, or you will have to decrypt it every step of the way to use that data. Now, both encryption and decryption are mathematical cost, which of course adds to system latency, but then it can also adds to your overall cost and the operating effectiveness of your system. So that's why data in use is something that we do not encrypt. However, there are still policies and control that should be applicable to protect your data in use. For example, if you are printing a file, make sure that you collect the printout and don't leave it unattended. Make sure that the data stored at your laptop is protected by password and your laptop is not being at a place unattended and unprotected without a password, and this similar kind of control mechanism. It is also important to look these three states in terms of the CIA triad that we have seen before in domain 1 of the CISSP. And what the CIA triad says that the confidentiality can be broken by disclosure, the availability can be broken by destruction, and the integrity is broken by alteration of the data. And in terms of the three estate, this CIA triad becomes very important because you can imagine that data at rest, you want to still maintain the confidentiality that nobody gets access to it who's not supposed to. You want to maintain the availability that if it is required for data to be available, that it remains available. That means the destruction aspect is prohibited and prevented. And you're making sure that the data at rest is not getting changed in terms of alteration is not possible, which is working in close coordination with the confidentiality aspect. Same is applicable for data in motion and data in use. It is also important to know that different data controls and the applicability of it may also depend on the data location. For example, take instance of a cloud. Cloud computer is nothing that it is somebody else's computing device that you are using for your own operational purposes, which means it could be that you may using the data in location X, but the actual data storage is happening in location Y. And what is that location Y becomes a very important aspect, especially for your data at rest, but also for your data in use, because you can imagine a local laws where the data is actually stored may be applicable. Take the case of China, which is behind the Great Firewall, where data that goes in stays in. Therefore, you want to be very careful when selecting, especially the cloud aspect, to make sure that the data location beside this tree state is also under your control. Otherwise, you may end up either losing your data or may end up not having access to your data. Which one is worse depends on the business that the data is used for. With this, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope to see you in the next video.